Okay, so a little more advanced animation, at least also a couple of more things to add just to the basics. So before I showed you the basics of animating using the channel box and keyframes, using the time slider down here, setting the specific settings that you want, and just basically how to get some simple animation set up. A couple things I want to add to that. I talked a lot about just kind of, in good practice, using just the channels that you're trying to animate, but sometimes you just need to go fast. So one thing that I had forgotten to mention last time was just a hotkey for setting a key. Instead of having to manually, right click and key all keyable or use the, using the auto key down here, but the S key for set key will set all of the keys at once for you. So if I go in and zoom in on this a little bit, hit the key on my keyboard, you can see a key set. And then I can move it over here. Whoops, and move the timeline. Move it to frame 30. And move it over here. Hit S again, 60. Move it up here, S again. Notice that all of these are turning red, and it goes ahead and keeps the motion. So that is part of kind of an in-between between using the auto key and having them all keyed, or really if you hit S, just once and then hit auto key, then that's probably the fastest way you could possibly get going. In fact, I'll start that over. So with nothing set, if I set the auto key thing, it's not going to really key anything that's not already set to be keyed. So it doesn't really do anything as I move around just initially by setting that auto key. And sometimes that can be a little confusing. But if I just hit the S key, which does the same as setting all the driven keys here, now I can move this around, and without even hitting it again, it's going to continue to set these keys for me automatically. But I think it's useful to only use the auto key really where necessary, and at least when you're beginning, to kind of use at least the S key to set your keys where you want. Now, another thing that's cool about using the S key, to be able to animate components of a model without having to necessarily create some kind of bone structure or anything like that. So it's a 3 key to smooth this. If I choose face and I've got my soft selection, this one's going to give me a nice kind of pull out of this. But if I, even in component mode, if I hit the key and, no object selected to set keys. Well, let me grab this face, hit the S key, and it sets keys for that actual face, which we're not seeing. I'm not sure where that actually shows up in the channel box. It might not, but when we set that, now I can go out to frame 30, and now I can take that thing and maybe bulge it out a little bit and hit the S key again to set it. And now I can see that that bulge just animated. Again, that's one of the real powers in Maya, is that you can really animate anything. You can animate any different node properties. So if I go out maybe at 30, maybe I'll select this one, set the key, out to 60, and I'll move this one out a little more extreme, move it down a little bit, set the key. Now I've got this weird morphing animation. You want some kind of just consistently looping animation, and there's a really easy way to do that inside of the graph editor. I want to show you that. So right now I just set up, and this is also a good example of the graph editor where you can see that there's only a couple of keys here, right? Like on these components, it's really just showing me the keys on the components themselves. If I found that exact one I clicked on before, if I go back to object mode, I don't see any keys, but that animation is still happening. All right, so be aware that the keys you see on the timeline down here are definitely context sensitive, what you have selected. I'm sure if I went in and selected those exact faces, it's going to show me the keys for them again. But a better way to deal with it is using the graph editor. So if I go inside of Windows, Animation Editors, Graph Editor, this is the one that we went through last time as well. First off, I can see in the list all these different objects that are moving and have keys associated with them. What this represents is all of the vertices that are moving because of that soft selection. Now, there's many, many, many components that are going on. So it's very easy to kind of blow up this list and all of a sudden just have so much in there you don't even know what to do. And that's where kind of that initial caution of, only animate the channels you need. You need to do component animation. Just kind of be aware that you're going to be working with a large set of data. but you can use the Alt key, again, to zoom out and zoom in on this different stuff. So I'll zoom in a little bit here, and we can basically see these curves that are happening as we play across, and that's just representing the changes there. But if I wanted to, let's see, it's like that's just showing me for those. Go back a little further. I'm going to be moving that one too. I have to move my frames out a little more to see that. There we go, back here. Okay, so anyway, there's a real easy way to duplicate that. You don't want to have to go in and manually set that up, continuously, copy and paste the keyframes. You could do it that way, but it would take a long time. It's a lot cooler in the graph editor here, where when we have whatever selected, I've got my main object selected, there's these icons up here in the upper right, these little squiggles right here. And you can see as I'm sizing the window, and grab it again, I'll use my touchpad, there we go. So you can see these four over here are locked to it. You may not see them at first because they kind of cut off right here, depending on how much screen real estate you have. But once you get past all the different tangents that we talked about last time, different ways to play with the easing in between keys, when we get out to the edge here, these here are the infinity cycles. So there's a pre-infinity cycle, followed by a pre-infinity cycle with offset, and a post-infinity cycle, and a post-infinity cycle with offset. What this basically means is that we could set a pre and post infinity cycle to tell it, okay, this object, whatever you're doing, just repeat that forever. And it's that easy. So if I just click on, now with an offset just means you put some kind of spacing between the loop. But in this case, I mean, maybe you can play with that if you want, as long as it's looping in general, but let's stick to just the non-offset one. You may be able to see in the very lower left corner of the screen in Maya, where in that text, it's telling me as I roll over what these are. So I don't really need to hit the pre-infinity cycle with this one because I'm starting it at 1. So I'm just going to hit the post-infinity cycle button. And if I zoom out now on my timeline, I can see that this little curve that's happening with those components is being repeated over and over and over again for the life of the animation. So now, even if I were to increase my animation to 300 frames down here, I just drag this to see the entire thing. If I were to go play through it, there we go. It's not the super smoothest thing right now, but it is repeating the animation over and over again without having to go do that. Next, I want to show you a little bit about deformers. So if we're in the modeling tab up here, you may have seen a lot of the Maya deformers. There's some just really advanced character tools in part of the deformers and things. So I'm going to show you just the basic ones, kind of show you where they're at. But interestingly enough, they show up in the modeling, and if I change to the animation set, they also show up there. Right? So we'll go through that set in a moment. But if I just create a default cube here, and my default cube has a lot of mesh to it, or at least a decent amount. So when I deform it, it has some resolution to actually deform. If this was just, having no cross sections and just a 1 by 1 by 1 cube and trying to deform it, it's not going to do much. You have to make sure you have enough polygons in there. But under this deform, now the basic ones that you would be most likely to use with simple animations, it's like the traditional animation, squash and stretch, are kind of hidden underneath this non-linear flyout. All right, so we get down here, we get non-linear, then bend, flare, sine, squash, twist, wave. These are all kind of the basic ones. That's what I'm going to show you in a moment, how to use one of them. But before I do, there's a lot in here, like specifically under muscle, and all these crazy different setups for doing muscles on characters. Once you've already got a skeleton set up and skin to your mesh and weighting, and you can use the paint tools to paint the weights of muscles and skin deformers. And there's a couple semesters of information in a lot of the character tools in Maya. It's really, really powerful. You have to do a little extra research to kind of look through what some of these deformers do. Let's use one of these non-linear ones. Let's, for example, try a twist here. And just like anything, you could open up kind of sample or the dialog box and see what the properties are. But I'm just going to click it. And right away, so I click on it. And if I'm in my attribute editor, I can see that it adds this twist node here. And if I wanted, I can see this is the stuff. I could start like using these sliders, the start angle and the end angle, to actually twist this model around, which is pretty cool. But usually with most of the tools in Maya, you can see it's got this green thing that's kind of showing me a little visually, but I'm trying to click on it and I just can't do it. Most of the time in Maya, I undo to before I set those settings, but I still have the twist. There's usually what's called a manipulator for these tools. The manipulators are what show up for the move, rotate, and scale tools that you can actually click on in the viewport. A lot of the advanced tools have a lot of different types of manipulators. Different lights have different types of manipulators. Like there's a whole series of manipulators on a traditional spotlight. You can show like the direction and the fall off and the penumbra and angles and all kinds of things. But with something like this, the way you get the manipulator on anything is you want to be in the channel box. And there's a little icon here like to show classic manipulators versus not showing them, but that should be on by default. There's some performance little check marks there too. But if I have the actual, here, so again, let me select the model. I'm actually going to smooth this so we can see a nice smoothed cube. But if I have it selected and I have the twist thing kind of highlighted and opened inside of the channel box, I should be able to go to Modify, Transformation Tools, and Show Manipulator Tool. And sure enough, we see this little thing show up, which now highlights when I mouse over. It has these little circles, which must be the particular manipulator for this tool. And I can click, and sure enough, I can interactively twist this cube around, which is really powerful to be able to do this. That would be difficult to do with certain deformers. You can do things much quicker that would be like natural squash and stretch and twisting around motions than you could possibly do with just moving things around, even with soft selection and components and stuff like that. So then down here is the other one where I basically can twist on either end. What's cool about these, the reason they show up in Animate also, this was the last tool, so I can click it again to get it to show up. There it is. But we can also animate these things. So if I just go and hit S to set a key, and it just sets on everything, I can go out to frame 30 and start twisting my cube up and hit S again. Maybe I'll go out to frame 60. Maybe now I'll grab the bottom of it, kind of untwist it, bring it the other way slightly. Sweet cube dance move. And now go back and play our animation. Oh, I decided to hit it backwards. We don't want to go backwards. There we go. And we're actually animating that deformer, which is really, really cool. So that's a nice little touch that there's a lot of things underneath deform down here. Most of them, like I would stick to just what's inside of the nonlinear, these basic ones. Most of the other ones are expecting kind of a more complicated situation to be used for the most part. But you can look into them, see what they are. Really, really good just to go through the Maya help, because it'll give you a nice kind of encyclopedic view that you can quickly click through and take a quick look at what some of these things do. And it'll give you little examples on how it works. So the next thing to show you is how do we actually render this? How do we actually render more than one frame at a time? Or how do we preview this? Now you can obviously preview your animation in the viewport. Depending on how complex it is, it may or may not run at 30 frames per second. That was that whole setting that I showed you that Maya defaults to play every frame, so you make sure and don't skip frames, but it doesn't always go fast enough. A lot of times you just want to render out a sequence and make sure the time is exactly on. And the quickest way you can render kind of what's in the viewport, even if I were on like shaded mode and had textures and stuff, which I'm not going to take the time to add, but it would use whatever we see in the viewport, but it just kind of creates an animation out of quick screenshots as fast as it can play through the timeline rather than having to actually render anything out. And that's through what's called Play Blast. But let me actually, just because this is close to the beginning, let me take a quick, I'll come right back to that, but just looking at these different menus that come when you change to the animation. So again, when we were in modeling, once you get to Windows, File, Edit, Create, Select, Modify, Display Windows, those are the same in every set. Then we had Mesh, Edit Mesh, Mesh Tools, Mesh Display, which are 4 huge menus, all having to do with polygon modeling, tons of tools. Curves and surfaces were all for NURBS modeling, stuff that's kind of outdated, but there may be certain situations where you want to use them. All the UV tools for texturing, the deformers we just talked about, which can be used for a modeling tool too, and then this Generate tab, and you get into that as paint effects, different physics stuff and all kinds of advanced things that we can talk about it a little later, point those out. Then when I get into animation, these all change. So right after Windows now, the most basic form is we have key. And I was showing you set key. You can see S, you can see the hotkey right here. You can see even that has different all manipulator handles and keyable attributes. So you can actually limit what you're setting keys on with that hotkey, which is actually pretty cool. So it's quite a bit of control over getting into the flow of animating there. But like I talked about last time, there's a whole heck of a lot of different types of keys. There's breakdown keys, driven keys, which will be like have the scale of this object affect the X position of that object. Bake keys, scale them, snap in, snap them, do lots of things with keys in there. Don't get too complicated. Under playback, all right, we've got a lot of the controls that you just have down here, but this playback blast is a really big one. I'm actually going to take a look at, where did that go? Showed up over here. I can see that, all right, I want to play blast just the time slider, and it's going to create this format, which should be a video format. We'll see what happens. It might be different on a PC or a Mac, but let's just go down, take the time slider down to like, I don't know, 70, because that's all I want to play blast. So I can just go to playback, play blast, and it's building, and poof, it's done. And now it just opened in my other screen. It opened in QuickTime and opened up this video to show. So play blast, really cool tool, very quick to see what you're needing. But then if you want to actually render out, all right, then we have to open up the render settings dialog box. And so far we've been playing in the Arnold renderer settings. In this common area is the other place we're going to have to set things up. But what we're going to do is we don't just render a video like the play blast does. We render individual PNG images for each frame. There's a lot of advantages to doing it that way. The biggest one is that at any given point, your render can be interrupted. It can stop. You've got to retake control of your computer. It can run out of juice or whatever. And whatever was rendered up to that point is retained in image files. The way you do that is in this main common, the very first file output area. By default, it's this weird EXR format. And we just want to change this to PNG. All right, so that's going to give us basic, screen quality. We don't need anything deeper than that, but it's not going to have any compression on it. PNG format. And we could go int 16 if we needed some transparency channel, which we don't, so you can just leave it at the default. Because not only do they need to be PNGs, but they very much need to have the right extension. And the default is just set to single frame, so it's not set up for animation. Instead, there's these different ways that Maya has set up for how it will name your file. Name.number.extension, name.extension. So what I think makes sense is we're just going to do this bottom one right before it starts to gray out. It is name_number.extension. So again, this was just two settings under the common render settings. Change it to a PNG and then change the sequence to be name_#extension. All right, so then the next part is what you're actually trying to render. So if I were to render a start frame at 1 and an end frame of 10, by frame every 1 frame, so you'll pretty much always want by every 1 frame, but you could be doing a test render, for example. You could set to render your entire animation and do it every 10 frames instead of every 1, and just see how it goes and compare the render times at the different positions in your scene, because as the camera moves around and as you're seeing different objects, those render times are going to vary. It's not just the same throughout. But this lets you set, so I'll leave this one set to 1 and 10 here. And then which camera you're trying to render. So right now I'm on the perspective, but you'll want to make sure and choose the correct camera that you're trying to render out of as well. And then when we hit close, so now I want to show you real quickly a couple of the character animation tools. So I'm going to change this to be a 4-up view here, because a lot of times when you are creating bones and skeletal systems, you're going to want to see some different views and have some 2D views, because bones are initially 2D to draw them. But let's go ahead and I'm going to make a cylinder here. Go to my poly modeling, make a cylinder, see it, great. And I'd say from this front view maybe is where I'm going to want to rig this up. So I'm going to rotate this down roughly, and then I'm going to scale it out, make it a bit longer. And what we're going to do is I'm going to treat this like a limb, like an arm or something, and we're going to put some bones in here and make this so we can kind of deform it in a natural kind of character way. But I would need some divisions here. Always important to remember to put enough divisions. Like, for example, if I were to smooth this right now, it turns into kind of a weird pill shape, and you can see the edging there. That's kind of ugly. So I want to make sure that my attribute editor, that cylinder shape, maybe I'll give it 10 divisions. Maybe I'll even give it 20. We don't really care about the cap. So that's fine. So now if I were to smooth it, now it keeps that shape much better and looks like an actual limb. In fact, maybe I will put something on the cap so that I'll give that 4. So that smooths a little better there. And there we go. That's all the difference in the world, just giving it that extra. And now this looks like a nice, clean shape. So those of you that haven't kind of dug into any advanced character animation or anything like that, there's the nomenclature. The way it works is you set up these things called bones with joints. You kind of set up an armature inside of your model. And once you have these bones or joints in the skeletal system, this armature, once you have it all set up, then you can what's called skin it to your mesh, which effectively turns your mesh into skin around these bones. And then as you move these bones around, it'll deform your mesh in a quasi-realistic way. And there's all kinds of tools to like adjust the weights of what's being affected by what bone. And you can get very, very deep with the setup, which is called rigging. So part of animation is rigging, and that's what you'll see in this drop down here. We've seen modeling, gone into animation, we've gone to rendering. I've showed you effects briefly, but rigging is what has all these tools. So I'm going to open up rigging here, and you can see that in the first one next to Windows, of course, is skeleton. So we've got all these different skeleton tools. In fact, there's also, whenever if you're animating, or if we're rendering, or if we get to rigging, there's always like a subset, or what Maya may consider the most widely used tools in a panel here. So you can always kind of play with that if you want. But when I'm beginning, I always like to look through the drop downs because they have every tool, and I like to kind of see what's there. So we've got the skeleton tools, and there's all kinds of these tops. Are all different ways to deal with joints. We're going to draw a few joints in a minute, show you how that works. And then the rest are dealing with IK, which stands for inverse kinematics. I'll show you what that means, how that works in a moment too. And then we'll get to skinning. We do a very basic bind skin. There's a couple of different ways to bind: binding and posing, interactive binding, unbinding. There's a lot of things in Maya that you can actually like paint with you can paint different weights and bindings. There's just a lot of cool ways to use some of these tools. But then there's a ton of tools just for the skin weights and maps, and all that means is just the different areas of the model that will deform according to how you move and rotate these different joints in your skeleton. And it can get really complicated, but once it's all set up and rigged, then you have all these little handles that you can use to move your character around in all kinds of different ways. But it is quite a deep rabbit hole to go into all the different tools to rig and skin a character. So then we see the deformers again, which just happen to show up in modeling and animation and rigging, because you'll use a lot of these deformers, like this wire deformer or wrinkles, or even the muscles that I showed you. A lot of that can be very high-end technical character rigging type stuff as well. It's kind of related to both, so they throw it in both. And then finally, you'll see constrain. This I'll talk a little bit more about when we talk about dynamics, but this is just an animation tool that, for example, if you had like something hanging from a nail on a wall that was swinging back and forth, you could maybe do it with some dynamic gravity field, swinging it back and forth, and you'd use a constraint to kind of limit animation in a certain way. So there's different ways to limit animation as well using constraints, but that's pretty deep, and we're not going to do too much with it, just kind of showing you what things are. And then there's controllers, which is once you've set up your skeleton and your rig and everything, these you can set up, like you can create geometry, like different spheres, and say this sphere controls this foot bone, or this controls that, finger. But just depending on how you're setting up your rig, you may want to give your animator, whether you're the one animating, a way to just easily grab obvious objects and have them move things around. That's what these these controllers are. So there's a lot here, and I'm just going to show you kind of the basics to throw a couple bones in and do some skinning. So I'm just going to click this Create Joints tool here, and what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to right click in this viewport, and maybe I will hit the space bar to bring it up. And when I draw these bones, so here, I'll just click some over here for a minute. I can click a bone, and that just made a joint. And you can see over here in the outliner, creates a joint. I can keep clicking, and it's going to keep making joints. Now I've got this kind of arm structure like this, right? And we're going to apply it to this in a moment, but for right now, I'll show you how this works. So as I'm creating joints, automatically in your outliner, it creates a hierarchy. So you can see that joint 1, joint 2, joint 3, and joint 4 are all like parent-child relationship of each other. Joint 1 controlling all of them, and as I go down the line, each of these joints highlighting a little bit different. Now, there's all kinds of attributes and things in the channel editor and stuff for things you can animate, but in a general sense, if I were to just want to, for example, rotate these around, if I had joint 1 selected and I choose rotate, it's going to rotate everything. So it's like moving from the shoulder, right? And then I could select just this, do it from the elbow, just this, do it from weird long wrist or whatever. And if I'm down at this last one, rotating it really doesn't have any effect. So this is what's called forward kinematics. Kinematics just basically means motion. And forward kinematics means from the top of the hierarchy, it's affecting everything going forward down the hierarchy. So even if I were to move this, for example, this little box giving me the 2 dimensions that are available in this view rather than doing individual arrows, it's going to move everything at once. Or I could move just these, and notice this bone kind of stretches and moves around and just stays connected, right? So depending on where I am in the hierarchy, it's going to move whatever's below it, and the rest of it, the most recent bone, is going to try and kind of get there. All right. So this gives animators a way to create a skeletal structure and kind of, you know, like you could move an entire arm at once like this without having to go in and move each individual piece. And you can go down the line and get individual, you know, motion from the spots where you want. So it can be pretty powerful when you put it all together. 2 arms, a leg, a spine, a neck, just all kinds of crazy rigs. But then found very quickly when you work with bones and animate in this way, that forward kinematics is kind of like stop motion animation in the sense that you really have to do a little tiny bit at a time, and you can get things done a lot faster and a lot more, I'd say, exact if, for example, you're trying to grab, you know, you're trying to put a foot on the floor, you're trying to grab a coffee mug or something with a hand. Having to rotate from this way and end, it's like the foot or the hand is usually, you know, where as an animator you want the motion to kind of generate from. So because of that, there's some algorithms that are called inverse kinematics, and we can do that by adding what's called an IK handle. And I can go into, you know, that's what all these are down here, create IK handle, all kinds of different ways to do it. But if I just quickly press this create IK handle, it's going to ask me, it's actually telling me IK handle tool, left mouse button to pick start joint for handle. So I'm going to click this shoulder joint, and then it's going to say left mouse button to pick end joint or end effector. I'm going to go down here to the end joint and click it. And now all of a sudden, I have a new node that's added. My joint hierarchy I still have as it is, but now I have this IK handle, this inverse kinematics handle. And because of that, now if I go in, I can still do the forward kinematics. If I grab my shoulder here and I try and rotate it, still rotates the whole arm. If I try and move it, still moves the whole arm, right? But now if I grab the end, watch what happens if I try and move this. Yes. Now instead of just the most recent bone, it's actually moving all of the bones together in some kind of way to try and keep everything connected in a realistic way. So let's attach this to our cylinder here. So I'm actually going to move this to the point where these bones are stretched out completely. Now that I have it set up, and I have this bone set up, and now I'm just going to region select around, which should grab my bone. I don't think it did. I'm going to shift select my joints here. So I've got both my joint hierarchy and my IK handle selected. And now I'm just gonna, that's not what I intended to do. Maybe I should just do a joint at a time. Maybe I will grab the top joint and move it. There we go. Move this into position. And notice that it's disappearing because these are just 2D objects. If I were to look at this in 3D space, and you can see that these bones, they do have some 3D shape to them, but they're not really meshes. So if you're in a shaded view, it's not really going to show up nicely. So usually when you are skinning or creating these rigs, it's good to start in an orthogonal view. But what it's really nice to do is just hit the 4 key, which will give you wireframe, so you can see right through your stuff. So now I can set this bones right into position. And now the last step, so we've created our skeleton hierarchy, we've created our IK handle, we've got our mesh here. So now I can go ahead and skin this, all right? So what this means is it does matter which order you select them in. You have to select both the joint hierarchy and the mesh, and I believe it's in that order. I believe you select the joint hierarchy first, and then you shift select the mesh. And in Maya, when you make multiple selections like that, you'll always see what was selected first turn white, and then what was ever most recently selected stays that selection green color. So when I have them both selected, I can go to Skin, Find Skin, and it seems to have done the thing. So what that means is I should be able to grab my joint or my end effector of my, well, maybe just the joint. And now if I move this around, ooh, I do need to grab the end effector. Isn't that letting me, why isn't that taking my IK handle into account? Oh, it doesn't look like I moved my IK handle with it. All right. Well, real quickly, I'm gonna skin this again real quick and just draw bones that are right in there. That's the way you should do it anyway, not necessarily moving them into position. So I've got my cylinder here. Now I can real quickly just draw a little bone structure, and then I'll take that bone structure, I'll create my IK handle from there to there. And now with all that selected, I'll select my mesh, the skin, find skin. There we go. Okay. But now you can see here, I'll go into the full 3D view here. You can see that now this cylinder now very much feels like an actual arm or something. In fact, you can even see the muscle, so to speak, bulge here. And that's the basics of setting up character animation, is you create these skeletons and these bones, and you're able to skin them to your mesh to be able to control them in these different ways. So then I could take their joint, rotate it, you know, kind of flex my muscle here, or at any point, grab my IK handle and move it around, do what I want to do to affect the whole thing in all kinds of crazy angles. And of course, you can key this stuff at any point, key to a whole bunch of things, move it, move my IK handle, key it again, and now we have that motion, right? So now Maya has some really cool tools to actually set up, I'm just going to fire up a new scene, to actually set up a skeleton very quickly. So if you look under skeleton, there's a quick rig thing, which is a little bit older, but the human IK is a system that got added in that very much lets you, so here, let's create a skeleton, and poof, we have a skeleton. We suddenly have this giant ominous creature here that is set up with all these finger joints and bone joints and toe joints, or it's just one toe joint. This is a basic little setup, but I could very quickly go through, and using this human IK, I can set up my character scale, how many different, so maybe I don't want 3 spine joints, maybe I want 7. So I can put that in, and poof, now there's 7 spine joints. So when you get into the definition, you can set up like specific, you know, you can grab all the bones. There's a lot of setup here to set up your controls, but it's a really, really cool starting point if you want to dig in. I'd recommend watching a couple videos on human IK if you want to see how quickly you can create a skeleton and apply it to a mesh. There's a lot of, there's test meshes like characters. If you ever want to go inside of window, where is it? General editors. I'm looking for, not the outliner. Content browser. Yep, that's what I'm looking for. It used to be called the asset manager, which is why I keep losing it. But there's a few different things in here. If we go into modeling, go into people, right? There's some different people here that you could load in, and they're nicely textured. You could play around with the human IK. In fact, let's load Sophia in here, see if it blows up the computer while I'm trying to screen share. Give this a few seconds. Oh, there we are. There is Sophia. And I don't think she's rendered, she posed, she doesn't have anything attached to her in terms of a skeleton. She's not really in a good skeleton pose. Usually you want your model in this T pose to be able to kind of skin them. But this is just a real quick kind of down and dirty overview of what some of these character animation tools are. Again, you go through and you can create entire skeletal systems either using the real quick human IK, or if you have different types of creatures aren't quite humanoid, you can create your own joint and bone skeletal systems. You skin them to your mesh. Lots of complications with like having the right part of the mesh deform in the right way from the right bone, setting constraints as far as how far a limb should be able to bend. So a good technical director is the term for someone in the 3D pipeline that does this, that does rigging and sets up all the characters and is that liaison between the modelers, textures, and the animators. Is a good technical director will have a rig set up where it's really foolproof, that an animator couldn't possibly, even if they tried to, for example, rotate a knee past backwards 90 degrees where the character would break what should be its natural body structure. So lots and lots of cool tools there. The last thing I wanted to show you is the editor. So I've showed you that there's quite a few animation editors. I showed you the graph editor, which is where we just use all the Bezier curves and the tangents and control things that way. This tracks editor is kind of an outdated version of the time editor. We don't really need that anymore. Camera sequencer, dope sheet, those kind of have their own purposes. Dope sheet's kind of outdated as well. The rest of these are all character animation specific. Just, you know, this is one of those editors. We're in there now. But one of the most powerful things, I keep saying Maya is really powerful with animation, this time editor, but it is an insanely badass, powerful, non-linear animation system where you basically create animation clips. And then if any of you have done any kind of video editing, use Premiere or After Effects or anything like that, and you can kind of cut clips and move them around and layer them, you can do all of that inside of the time editor. So you could, for example, have a character, like a Kung Fu character, that might be doing 3 different punches and 3 different kicks. So you've got 6 different animations, 3 punches and 3 kicks. You could set up you could set up those clips, and you could create an infinite number of punches and kicks by like stretching them and slowing down the motion or layering them together. And you can have Maya actually blend shape in between clips, which is really powerful. What you can do is save animation clips, line them up, all kinds of things. So, you know, it won't do it justice just showing you with primitives and some basic stuff. So what I would highly recommend you do is just go to YouTube. In fact, I'll show you the 2 I recommend you watch. There's a whole series, this Maya time editor, that there's like 8 parts where you can get really deep with this guy that you can see. The first part's 5 minutes, part 5 is 16 minutes. There's a couple hours worth that you can go through with just the time editor. And this is probably the best one if you know you're all about animation and really want to, you know, dig in deep with the time editor. But this one here, there's 2 I'd recommend. This one here with this monster character, only 18 minutes long. This week I'm going to show you guys. And what it's going to do is show you like on a big rigged character. So you see all the bones coming through and all of this. You get to a specific spot where you're showing something kind of cool.
Maya LT or Maya will automatically create a blend transition between the 2 animations for us. You see he walks forward and begins to blend into the death animation. Nice.
All right, so I mean, you can look at this just on a larger level with a character here. The other one that I'd highly recommend besides this one is if we go down a little bit, this one here, again, it's only 15 minutes. A lot of these are from 2017 because that's when this tool was added to Maya, it was new. But this one has a couple of characters in like a fight scene. And it takes a while to get into, but once you're into it and you see the setup, it's just really powerful and really cool to see how using this time editor, you can do some really advanced techniques as far as tying characters together, locking things together, just all kinds of stuff with animation. Once you get to the level of like character animation, really complicated scenes, you're gonna end up with like hundreds, if not thousands of keyframes. And having to not wrangle those in a graph editor or manually with keyframes or using a little shift selector thing to multiple select and move things around, let alone reuse animations, reapply them. There's just a sea of stuff that you can do inside of that time editor. And I'd highly recommend that you look into it a little deeper and watch a couple videos with a very advanced scene and kind of see how that works.